level rise is the process where basically water is transferred to the ocean, for example, through the melting of ice that is located on land, in particular ice from the large ice sheets like Greenland and Antarctica. And another important component of sea level rise is the rise that is the result of increasing temperatures of ocean water that leads to expansion, and that fact alone can lead to a rise of sea level. Subsidence would be defined as basically the vertical movement of the land, and in the context of this subject, we are talking specifically about land in the coastal zone relative to sea level. The reason we often consider sea level rise and subsidence together is that they often have a similar net effect, and in the sense that if you imagine a given location on the coast, on any coast, and we face a situation like we do today where sea level is rising globally, the net effect on that particular site will be similar compared to a situation where that site was just subsiding and maybe global sea level was stable, but you can imagine that the net effect, that relative sea level rise, which is the sum of those two components, would actually be essentially the same. So think about a coastal marsh, it doesn't really matter whether relative sea level is rising because of sea level rising on a global scale versus whether it's due to subsidence. For the marsh, it's going to be just as difficult to deal with. It's important to note first that whether sea level is rising on a global scale or we're dealing with a local subsidence situation, it doesn't really matter for the coast. For the coast, the net result is going to be something very similar. That's why we usually consider these two things together when we talk about relative sea level rise, which basically is the sum of global sea level rise plus local subsidence to the extent that occurs. When that is the case, then one of the most obvious impacts is coastal erosion, where basically the shoreline is retreating. We see that in particular on sandy shorelines that retreat sometimes very rapidly, and that currently happens in many parts of the world. There are also other impacts, and an impact that is very widespread here on the Gulf Coast is the loss of coastal wetlands. That's a very complex problem that has many different causes, but one of them is this relative sea level rise, which basically leads to submergence of marshlands and basically transform them into open water. For the Gulf Coast, these processes have many impacts, and it, for example, has many economic impacts, and we could look at two different sectors. For example, the energy industry, which is of course a major player on the Gulf Coast, has an enormous amount of infrastructure in the coastal zone and offshore, like pipelines, for example. Many of those were built in wetlands that are now gone and are now suddenly have been transformed into open water. So that makes infrastructure like that much more vulnerable to things like storms and related processes. Another example is fisheries, which is another major industry on the Gulf Coast and is economically very important. Fisheries depend heavily on coastal wetlands because nearly all marine organisms that are of interest to fisheries spend some part of their life cycle in these coastal wetlands or depend on them in maybe an indirect way. So the loss of these wetlands has enormous implications for fisheries, especially in the longer term in the future.